This is lecture 6 for Biology 178 with the start of the endocrine system lectures. There will be 3 of these lectures, and this is endocrine system 1. The endocrine system is one of several cell-to-cell communication systems in the body. It's very similar to the nervous system in this respect. However, there are some differences. Now, both use chemicals that bind to specific receptors on their target cells, and they share chemical messengers. They are called neurotransmitters in the nervous system, things like acetylcholine or dopamine. And they're called hormones in the endocrine system. Examples of this would be testosterone, growth hormone, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Both the nervous system and the endocrine system are regulated primarily by negative feedback, where they make changes to the body based upon the given response or stimulus that they get that is an opposite nature to what that stimulus is. The common goal of both is to preserve homeostasis, hence the negative feedback mechanism. It does this by coordinating and regulating other cells, tissues, organs, and systems. The major difference between them comes in the fact that the nervous system is capable of more complexity. It is allowing itself to change and process this information, and it conducts signals over long distances using electricity in the form of action potentials. The endocrine system, however, releases hormones into the circulatory system that will travel through our blood and then bind to those target cells elsewhere in the body. So, what is a hormone? A hormone is defined as a regulatory substance that stimulates specific cells or tissues into action. Now, hormones must be secreted into the blood by a specialized endocrine cells and are transported via the circulatory system. In many cases, cellular targets for hormones are very far away. The hormones themselves are secreted by endocrine glands or endocrine cells, and hormones can function at very low concentrations. You just need a little bit to actually elicit a response. Hormones function by binding to specific cellular receptors. So only cells that actually have these receptors will respond to that hormone. It must be mentioned too that cells can have multiple receptors for multiple types of hormones. So one cell can respond to several different hormones. Hormones must be degraded or eliminated in the system to terminate their physiological action. So they'll keep their physiological action up so long as the concentration of them is present. This action of elimination is usually performed by the kidney or liver, where these hormones are broken down and resynthesized into the system. Hormones come in 3 different types, and this is based upon what they're actually made of, what they are derivatives of. Amino acids, proteins or peptides, and steroids or lipids. The first type is amino acid derivatives. Amino acids, remember, are going to be the building blocks for proteins, so these are going to be a simpler overall structure. The examples that we have here are thyroid hormones produced by the thyroid gland, things like triiodothyronine and thyroxine. These are going to generally stimulate metabolism in the body. And then catecholamines. Catecholamines would be things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are actually produced by the adrenal medulla and are more commonly known of as adrenaline. The second classification of hormones in the body are protein or peptide hormones. Now, this makes up the largest majority of hormones in the body. Most hormones are actually protein or peptide based. They are initially synthesized as prohormones, which are actually an inactive form of this hormone molecule, and they get converted to the active form later on. Peptide hormones can range from short polypeptide chains of amino acids to small proteins. This even includes some glycoproteins. All protein hormones act by binding to receptor molecules on the cell surface. This binding causes a response from inside the cell, in many cases simply to turn on. Example of this would be thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. TSH is going to actually be secreted by the anterior pituitary gland and then activate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones and stimulate the metabolism. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are two hormones that are also produced at the anterior pituitary gland and have different effects in both men and women, but in general, they're going to activate many of the sex hormones as well as reproductive cells. Here we can see an example of an insulin hormone. We can see a single peptide made up of multiple amino acids as it is linked together. So this is showing you the different peptide chains to create a polypeptide prohormone. The final category of hormones are steroid hormones or lipid derivatives. A lot of people know the term steroid and usually associate with anabolic steroids. The reason that it is actually called a steroid is because it is a derivative of fats or lipids and specifically synthesized from cholesterol molecules. So it actually has nothing to do with its effect of building muscle because not all steroid hormones build muscle. It means that they're actually derivative of lipids. Now, most of these lipid derivatives are going to consist of carbon rings and side chains built from cholesterol. Steroid hormones are released by reproductive organs, adrenal cortex, and the kidney, and they bind to specific transport proteins in the blood, and they can remain in circulation longer than peptide hormones. And this is because fat takes longer to break down than protein, so it's going to have an overall longer life in the blood. There we can see a cholesterol molecule and how similar it looks to a testosterone molecule. Now, how do hormones work? Well, hormones actually are released into the blood to act upon specific cells. For a cell to respond to a hormone, it must have that specific receptor, or a circulating hormone cannot affect the cell. Every cell has receptors for many different hormones, and the number and types change over time and with different body conditions, as in homeostatic need. The hormone can cause the cell to modify its genes or change its cellular function. It does this through one of two pathways. The first pathway is direct gene activation. This is what is used by steroid and lipid-soluble substances. Steroid-based hormones use specific and direct pathways to activate the cell. First, they diffuse through the membrane, bind with a cytoplasmic receptor, enter the nucleus as a receptor hormone complex, and then trigger the gene transcription. If we remember gene transcription, this is the copying of DNA into the messenger RNA. The newly formed messenger RNA will thereby direct protein synthesis and alter cell activity. Here we can see a diagram illustrating direct gene activation, which is performed by steroid hormones. The steroid hormone will diffuse into the cell membrane, as can be seen. Then it will bind to that receptor protein. From there, it forms a receptor hormone complex, which then is going to trigger gene transcription. Gene transcription, remember, is copying DNA into messenger RNA. This newly formed messenger RNA is translated and going to direct protein synthesis, which is the creation of new proteins to actually alter cell activity. So it's altering the genetic code in order to issue new commands. And it could be something as simple as trying to increase the overall body hair growth if you release more testosterone. And so it's going to actually cause that change in cell response. The other way that hormones communicate with the body is going to be through the second messenger system. Now, this is for all protein, peptide hormones, as well as amino acid hormones. So essentially, water-soluble or non-steroid-based hormones. Now, this works by binding first to a membrane receptor. It is thereby going to activate a G protein, which will activate the enzyme adenylase cyclase. Adenylase cyclase is going to convert adenosine triphosphate to cyclic AMP. The newly activated cell messenger, cyclic AMP, will thereby activate protein kinases. Protein kinases are enzymes that modify proteins by adding on phosphate molecules. So it's working on coding effectively. This, the protein kinase, will alter the cell activity. So here's a diagram covering the second messenger system. Here we can see a non-steroid hormone that is actually going to be the first messenger that will bind to the receptor protein. This will activate that G protein, receptor protein, thereby activating the enzyme of adenylate cyclase to convert ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. Cyclic AMP is going to activate protein kinase, which is an enzyme that modifies proteins by adding on phosphates. Anytime we add on molecules to different compounds, it changes the meaning or what that compound does. So you can think of these as different key codes that are going to give cellular commands. Our cells don't communicate with written language, they communicate through the transfer of molecules. So by changing or adding phosphates onto different proteins, we thereby are giving different commands and affecting cellular function. In this case, it could be something like glucagon coming in, binding, and affecting glycogen inside the cell to break down and be released into the bloodstream. Now, how are hormones triggered? Hormone levels in the body are regulated through mostly negative feedback. Some are positive feedback, like oxytocin during pregnancy. These negative feedback loops strive to maintain homeostasis. The regulation of these loops, as with all feedback loops, involves an initial stimulus. There are three ways that the endocrine system regulates homeostasis. The first is hormonal. This is the most common. Here, endocrine glands are activated by other hormones. An example would be anterior pituitary gland hormone activates another gland to produce a hormone. The second way that hormones are triggered is humoral. Humor refers to the actual blood or fluids inside the body. Here, varying ion concentrations in the blood can activate glands. An example would be parathyroid hormone, which is activated by calcium levels, or insulin, which is activated by blood sugar levels. The final way hormones can be triggered is neural. Here, nerve impulses stimulate hormone release. This is generally sympathetic regulated. An example of this would be, of course, epinephrine. If you have a sympathetic nervous system response, your fight or flight engages, your body will neurologically activate the adrenal medulla to produce adrenaline, epinephrine. So we've talked about hormones briefly and how they function. Now we're going to look at the endocrine system overall and some of its gross anatomy. The endocrine system, as we will focus on it, includes those organs whose primary function is hormone release. Those include the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, both anterior and posterior lobe, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the pancreatic islets of the pancreas, the pineal gland, and the parathyroid gland. There are many other tissues in the body that secrete hormones, but endocrine function is secondary. Examples of these would, of course, be heart, kidneys, your intestines, the thymus, and reproductive organs. We will briefly talk about the reproductive organs in this lecture series, but only in the case of their endocrine function. The others we will actually not be focusing on in this lecture, but we'll mention when they're actually brought up in later lectures. So this is a diagram overview of the major endocrine glands in the body. We'll start up at the top. The hypothalamus, pineal gland, and pituitary gland are all in the dicephalon portion of the brain. The pituitary gland actually hangs off of the hypothalamus, if you remember, and the pineal gland will be in the epithalamus in the back. Going down from there, we get to the larynx in the respiratory system in the upper throat region, and here we have the thyroid gland. On the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland are 4 dots, and this is the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is going to be involved in calcium regulation, whereas the thyroid gland is involved in calcium regulation and metabolism. Moving down from there, we get into the digestive region. This is going to have the pancreas. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the pancreatic islets, which only make up about 1% of the total volume of the pancreas, and they control blood sugar levels. And then the adrenal glands, one on top of each kidney. These are going to serve a multitude of functions in the body. From there, if we go down to the actual pubic region, we then see the testes and the ovaries. Testes for male, ovary for female, and they serve a lot of secondary functions in the body with respect to reproductive system, but they also secrete a number of hormones in the body. So these will make up the majority of the endocrine glands that we'll talk about. Now I'm taking you through a brief chart. In your lecture notes, I've also listed out this chart. I'll briefly go over how this chart is organized, and then we'll actually talk about each different header and take you through each hormone. The first gland that we'll talk about is the pineal body. This is going to be in the epithalamus. The gland, as you can see, is pineal body, shows you a picture of its location. Hormone that it secretes is melatonin. This is an amino class hormone, so it's an amino acid. What does it do? That's representative actions. It is involved in the biological rhythms and daily and seasonal. So it's going to help with dealing with day and night cycles, and it's regulated by light and dark cycles, specifically by the presence or absence of blue light. In the absence of blue light, melatonin production increases, and you can thereby go to sleep. That's why blue light screens or sunlight, which is in a blue sky, is what actually keeps you awake longer. The hypothalamus is going to be the next gland. Now, this actually creates two hormones, but these hormones are released by the posterior pituitary gland, which we'll talk about. These two hormones are oxytocin, which is a peptide hormone, and stimulates the contraction of the uterus and the milk letdown reflex. It is stimulated in response or produced in response to the uterine stretching and or the suckling of a baby on the teat. The other hormone produced by the posterior lobe is anterior diuretic hormone, or ADH, also known as vasopressin. This is also a peptide-based hormone and promotes retention of water by the kidneys. The hypothalamus produces this in response to water or salt imbalance. We'll talk more about this specific mechanism in the urinary system. The anterior pituitary gland actually produces the most amount of hormones. Here, growth hormone is going to be protein class and stimulates the growth of bones and metabolism. Prolactin is going to be a protein hormone that stimulates milk production. Follicle stimulating hormone is a protein hormone that stimulates production of ova and sperm. You can notice by now that all of the anterior lobe hormones are protein-based. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovaries and testes to actually produce their respective sex hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to actually produce thyroid-based hormones that affect metabolism. And then finally, adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to stimulate adrenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoids. This would be things like cortisol, which deals with stress. The thyroid gland creates thyroxine and triiodothyronine. These are going to be the thyroid hormones that actually stimulate metabolism, and they are amino-based. So besides regulating metabolism, the thyroid gland also helps to reduce blood calcium levels with calcitonin, which is a peptide class hormone. Antagonistic to calcitonin is parathyroid hormone produced by the parathyroid glands. It is a peptide-based hormone that raises blood calcium levels. We'll skip over the thymus gland, that will not be on the exam, and move to the adrenal glands, which are composed of the adrenal medulla and the cortex. The medulla makes epinephrine and norepinephrine. In general, these are going to deal with sympathetic nervous system response. So because of this, they raise blood glucose, increase rate of metabolism, and constrict certain blood vessels. So think fight or flight response. The adrenal cortex releases a multitude of hormones. First off being glucocorticoids. A common one of this is known as cortisol, a stress hormone that deals with the increase of blood glucose. It increases your blood glucose when released. Mineralocorticoids, an example would be aldosterone, are going to promote reabsorption of sodium and excretion of potassium in the kidneys to deal with the regulation of these ions. The pancreas is primarily a digestive organ, but 1% of it is composed of the pancreatic islets and produces insulin and glucagon. These are antagonistic hormones. Both are protein class or peptide class. Insulin reduces blood glucose. Glucagon raises blood glucose. Finally, we have the gonads, the testes for men and the ovaries for women. The testes release androgens, one of the major ones being testosterone. These are going to be a steroid-based hormone that supports sperm formation, development, and maintenance of male secondary sex characteristics. In the ovaries, we have two steroid hormones as well, estrogens, which stimulate uterine lining, growth, development, and maintenance of female secondary sex characteristics, and progesterone, which promotes the growth of the uterine lining, so that way it can develop overall for an incoming fetus. Now, this finishes the different hormones in an overview. We'll now be breaking down the specific glands and going in depth into each of them, the hormones that they produce, and the effects that they have on the body.